Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the books of Robert McCammon. He is a horror author who I think was at the peak of his fame in the late 80s and early 90s. And, most people automatically go to Stephen King or Peter Straub or somebody, but I personally think McCammon is very underrated. So my experience with Robert McCammon started when I was a teenager. My mother used to buy books for me sometimes from the grocery store. And, it's funny because my aunt would give me these kind of gift certificates to like B. Dalton, these kind of smaller bookstores. And I would get books that I really wanted from those stores, from these gift certificates that I get for like Christmas or my birthday or something. But my mother knew I liked to read, but she didn't really quite understand maybe what I liked to read. I mean, she kind of did, but she kind of didn't. So sometimes she'd bring this random book home from the grocery store, right? This is actually how I discovered the Dark Towers series. You can check out my video there on it if you want to know more about that. She also brought me home a Robert McCammon book, and the book was called The Wolf's Hour. A British secret agent who is also a werewolf must use his supernatural abilities to fight the Nazis during World War II and stop a terrifying secret weapon. This book really surprised me. Not long before I got this book, I had read Stephen King's novella, The Cycle of the Werewolf, which I think is a pretty straightforward werewolf story. I wasn't prepared for what was in The Wolf's Hour. I'll actually say this, I've never read a book like it. It had the strangest mix of genre in it that it doesn't sound like it would work, but it actually worked quite well. It had cool spy stuff and this kind of tortured protagonist, which many werewolves are. But the thing I wasn't actually bargaining for is the amount of sex in this book. There are many, many, many sex scenes in this book. For someone who was a teenager, I was just like, what is going on here? And not only are they sex scenes, but I'm not sure how to say this on YouTube without getting in trouble, perhaps. Let's just say that... Okay, so the book is actually split up into kind of two parts. It's split up into the spy story, which is the present, but then he also kind of tells his backstory. And in his backstory, he's kind of part of this pack. And there's just a lot of crazy stuff that happens with this pack. And I'll say it leans more towards the animal than the human. Let's just say that. Around the time of reading this, I started working at a movie theater. First as an usher, and then later as a projectionist. So as a projectionist, I had a lot of free time. And The Wolf's Hour blew me away, so I was just like, I need to get more of this guy's books, because this was not his first book. He had several before this. So, I took a little stroll to the local bookshop, which was in the mall. I think it was a B. Dalton, if I recall, because those were in all the malls back then. But it might have been a Walden Books. I'm not really sure. But I picked up two of his titles, and the first one I picked up was called The Night Boat, and the second one was called They Thirst. So The Night Boat was from 1980, and it's a sunken German U-boat that is accidentally raised from the ocean floor, unleashing a crew of undead soldiers and a nightmare on a small Caribbean island. And They Thirst is from 1981. A Los Angeles detective must confront an ancient vampire lord and his growing army of bloodthirsty followers as they plot to turn the city into their personal feeding ground. So I read both of these in this projection booth. Actually, I think I actually read most of his books in the projection booth, maybe aside from Wolf's Hour. I went on kind of like a tear where I went through many, many of his books in a row. I was a big fan back then. I don't really get into it now so much, and I'll explain that in a minute, but at the time, these two books scared the hell out of me. The Wolf's Hour wasn't really that scary. It was more of an action story, whereas these two books were kind of terrifying. The Night Boat was especially scary because of being in this enclosed room that, if you've ever seen what a projection booth looks like, it doesn't look that much different than kind of submarine or something, because there's lots of pipes on the ceiling and there's all this kind of gadgetry and stuff around. It's just a very industrial kind of setting and a very empty and kind of lonely and foreboding setting. And for someone reading a book like this alone late at night waiting for movies to end, it was quite terrifying. And They Thirst was also quite scary. The one thing I'll say about his books is, on the surface they always kind of seem like a trope or like these different kind of genre conventions. However, he finds ways to kind of twist them and to subvert the tropes a little bit. In They Thirst, it's a vampire story, but it's more of a vampire story as almost like a biological pandemic or something. And it's in LA and the outskirts of LA. If you've ever seen the film Near Dark, it has that kind of vibe more than like straight up vampire vibes. And yeah, it's quite scary, especially as the pandemic kind of starts to overtake the city. He did this really cool thing when they change into vampires. This is a minor spoiler, I guess. But they kind of like build these kind of cocoons underneath their beds and stuff with like sheets and all these different things. And it's really grimy, and I don't know. It really takes the romantic notion out of the vampire, I think. It makes it kind of sick and grotesque in a lot of ways, actually. Eventually, I moved on to a book called Swan Song, which was from 1987. And this is kind of his answer to Stephen King's The Stand. After a nuclear apocalypse devastates the world, a group of survivors must battle both human and supernatural forces as they fight for the future of humanity. This was similar to The Stand, but it had its own kind of voice and story. I mean, the only similarities is that it's kind of like apocalyptic and that there's this large cast and fight for good versus evil. Aside from that, there's quite a lot of differences. But I thought this was excellent, and it's quite long too. I don't think it's as long as Stephen King's, but it's definitely up there. And then over the next year, I read many more of his books. Usher's Passing, which is a modern day reimagining of Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, where you see the lineage kind of go further down the line. Bethany's Sin, which was from 1980. A man moves his family to the idyllic town of Bethany's Sin, only to discover it hides a dark secret involving a cult of women. And then in 1990, he released Mine, which is kind of this strange book about a kidnapped baby, and this mother has to embark on this journey to track down this unhinged woman. And then there's Stinger. In a small Texas town, the inhabitants become trapped in a deadly battle between two warring alien species. Yeah, but I mean, as a teenager, they scared the hell out of me. Well, how about as an adult? In preparation for an occult zombie serial I wrote last year, I decided to take a plunge into Night Boat and They Thirst again to kind of get the inspiration for that sort of zombie/vampire vibe. And I have to say they hold up. They're still quite scary. It's not like I wouldn't say he's high art or anything. However, I think they're pretty good stories, and I definitely think they hold up. In the early 90s, he took a 10-year hiatus, and he returned and branched out into other genres, but I didn't really get into any of those. I've heard they're kind of not... I heard that the writing is better, but they're not like his horror books, and I just really liked his horror books. So maybe someday I'll try them out, but I haven't. Maybe I will. Anyway, if you're looking for something scary this Halloween, and you've gone through all the Stephen King books or the Clive Barker books, take a crack at these. I think they're pretty good, and I think you could do worse. Anyway, that's all I got, and take care. Have a good day.